The restaurant manager's hand closed around the back of the wheelchair before the old man even had a chance to speak. Not a gentle redirect. Not an apologetic murmur about available seating. A grip, firm, dismissive, the kind a person uses on something they want moved out of the way. And then a hard pivot toward the back corridor, toward the narrow table wedged between the kitchen door and the service station, where the noise of clattering pans and shouted orders made conversation impossible, and the smell of industrial grease hung in the air like something that had given up trying to leave. "This way," the manager said. Just that. No, sir. No apology. The word dropped like a receipt nobody wanted. Every table near the window kept their eyes on their food. If you've ever watched someone be erased in public, truly erased, not argued with, not confronted, just quietly moved aside like furniture, you know the specific silence that follows. The way a room collectively decides not to see something. The way people suddenly find their wine very interesting. That was Velour 88 on a Friday night in Seoul, and that was the moment everything in that room began to break, though nobody understood it yet. If you were in that restaurant tonight, if that had been your father, your grandfather, someone you loved, what would you have done? Looked away? Or stood up? Hit that like button right now and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Because I promise you, you are not prepared for who that man in the wheelchair actually is. Hint. The reservation had been made 3 weeks in advance. Table 7, window seat. The kind of table that required a specific phone call to a specific assistant who spoke to a specific maitre d', who then quietly confirmed that yes, the booking was legitimate, and yes, the name attached to it carried enough weight that the head chef had been informed. None of that information made it past the front podium on Friday evening. What made it past the front podium was a man in a motorized wheelchair, arriving alone, dressed in a dark charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who don't need to advertise the expense. His face was angular and still. Not peaceful still, but carved still, the way stone looks after weather has worked on it for years. Late 40s, maybe early 50s. Korean. The kind of handsome that age had refined rather than diminished. His hands rested in his lap, motionless. Behind him, at a distance that might have looked casual to someone not paying attention, stood 2 men in dark coats near the entrance. They didn't follow him inside. They simply existed at the periphery, the way serious weight exists at the edge of a conversation. The man in the wheelchair approached the host's stand without hurrying. He didn't announce himself. He waited. The host, young, maybe 23, wearing the practiced expression of someone performing professionalism they hadn't yet earned, looked up from the tablet, looked at the wheelchair, looked back at the tablet. "Name?" The man said nothing. The host frowned slightly. "Sir, I need a name for the reservation." Still nothing. The man's eyes moved to the window tables. Table 7 specifically, where a candle burned in a low glass, where the Seoul skyline pressed itself against the glass like a painting that knew it was being looked at. The host's jaw shifted. He typed something, looked up again. We have some availability near the back. There's a table that might be more..." He paused, selecting his language. "More accessible." The words sat there between them. The man in the wheelchair looked at the host for a long moment, not with anger, with something quieter and considerably more dangerous. The attention of someone cataloging. The host mistook the silence for agreement. He came around the stand, gripped the back of the wheelchair, and began to push. The man's hand moved, just slightly, to the joystick control on the armrest. A small correction. A signal that he had not surrendered control of the chair. The host either didn't notice or chose not to. They moved through the restaurant, heads turned with the specific choreography of people trying to appear as though they weren't turning. The tables near the window stayed full of suited executives and women in silk and couples performing their intimacy for each other, and none of them made eye contact as the wheelchair rolled past. The table beside the kitchen had no candle. The cloth was slightly rumpled, as though it had been reset in haste. The noise from behind the door was a constant percussion of metal on metal, someone's voice cutting through in Korean. Not words, just tone, the pressurized tone of a kitchen in the middle of service. The host pulled out a chair, unnecessary, reflexive, and then seemed to realize what he'd done and pushed it back in. He handed over a menu without looking directly at the man. "Someone will be with you shortly." He walked away quickly. The man in the wheelchair sat in front of the kitchen door, in the worst seat in the best restaurant in Seoul, and said nothing. His hands returned to his lap. His eyes moved around the room with that same quality of attention, not hostility, not pain, just watching, memorizing. Nia Brooks had not planned to be at Velour 88 that night. The dinner reservation was a gift from her business partner, Yemi, who had decided that closing their first seven-figure wholesale contract with a Seoul-based cosmetics distributor deserved more than takeout eaten over a conference table covered in signed paperwork. "You need to actually feel it," Yemi had told her over the phone from Lagos. "Go somewhere that costs too much. Order something you can't pronounce. Feel like you made it, because you did." So Nia had put on the dress she'd bought 6 months ago in anticipation of exactly this kind of evening. Navy blue, structured at the shoulder, the kind of dress that said, "I am not here to be overlooked." And she'd taken a taxi to an address in Gangnam that her phone confirmed was real, but that still felt slightly fictional when she stepped out of the car and looked up at the brushed steel lettering above the entrance. She was 38 years old. She had spent 11 years building a skincare brand out of a rented studio apartment in Atlanta, reformulating products on a secondhand hot plate, learning Korean manufacturing standards from YouTube tutorials and cold emails that mostly went unanswered. She had been told, at various points by various people, that she was in the wrong market, the wrong country, the wrong demographic, entering at the wrong time. The contract she'd signed that afternoon was worth $2.3 million. So she walked into Velour 88 the way a woman walks into a room when she's done arguing with people who told her she couldn't. The host assigned her a table without incident, center of the room, good sight lines, the kind of placement that communicated a basic level of visible respect. She ordered water. She opened the menu. She let herself exhale for the first time in what felt like 3 weeks. Then she heard the sound. Not a loud sound, a small one. The specific sound of a motorized wheelchair making a small mechanical correction, the soft whir of the motor, and then the silence as it stopped. She didn't know why she looked up. Maybe the sound was distinctive enough. Maybe some instinct oriented her toward it. She watched the host push the wheelchair toward the back of the room. She watched the man in the chair, his posture, the stillness of it, the deliberateness of him making no protest. She watched the table they brought him to, the kitchen door, the absence of any of the atmosphere that the front of the restaurant had been so careful to construct. And she felt something move through her chest that wasn't quite anger yet, but was auditioning for it. She knew that particular choreography. She'd been in it herself, in different rooms, in different cities, in different industries. The moment where a space decides you belong somewhere smaller, and says so without a word, banking on the fact that most people would rather absorb the insult than create a scene. She watched the host walk away from the man without looking back. She set down her menu. She did not think through what she did next. She did not calculate the social cost of it, did not consider whether it was her place, did not ask herself what would happen if she was wrong about what she'd just witnessed. She simply stood up from her table, walked across the restaurant, and stopped beside the wheelchair at the table by the kitchen door. "That was rude," she said. The man looked up at her. His eyes were dark and sharp and very awake. Up close, she could see that his face carried evidence of something. The slight asymmetry that came from scar tissue hidden under skin, a tension in the jaw that looked like it had been there so long it had become structural. He said nothing. "There's a window table," she said, "with a candle and a view, which is what you reserved, I'm guessing." Still nothing. She reached for the wheelchair handles, then stopped herself. "Can I?" she asked. "Or do you drive?" Something moved in his expression. Not a smile, too small for that. A flicker. He reached for the joystick control and moved the chair slightly forward, which she understood as an answer. She walked alongside him toward table 7. The room noticed. Not dramatically. No one gasped, no one stood up. But the particular silence of a room adjusting to something it didn't expect settled over the tables nearest them. She could feel the host watching from the podium. She didn't look at him. At table 7, she pulled out the opposite chair and sat down across from the man in the wheelchair, as naturally as if she'd planned to dine with him all along, which she hadn't. She didn't entirely know why she stayed. Something about leaving him there alone felt incomplete. "I'm Nia," she said. "I don't usually just sit down at strangers' tables, for what it's worth." He looked at her. The candlelight shifted between them. "You can tell me to go," she said. "I won't be offended." He didn't tell her to go. The host appeared at the table within 3 minutes, accompanied by a man Nia assumed was the floor manager. Older, more expensive suit, the practiced authority of someone who'd spent years managing difficult moments in elegant spaces. "Ma'am." The manager's attention went to Nia first. "Your table is prepared for you at—" "I'm fine here," Nia said. "This table is—" A pause. A recalibration. "This table has already been— There may be some confusion about the booking for this— Is this table 7? She asked. The manager's mouth closed. "Because the number on the little card on the table says 7, she said. "And I'm guessing this gentleman's reservation says table 7. So I'm not sure where the confusion is." The man in the wheelchair watched this exchange with the quality of someone observing something they had anticipated and were now confirming. His hands were still in his lap. He hadn't spoken a word. The manager adjusted his stance. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to return to your assigned—" "I'd like to order," Nia said. A silence. The kind that has several layers to it. The manager looked at the man in the wheelchair. Something in the man's expression, or the absence of any expression at all, that controlled, settled stillness, seemed to give the manager pause, like a person who has just realized they might have misjudged the depth of water they're standing in. He left without another word. Nia exhaled. "That man," she said, mostly to herself. Across the table, the man in the wheelchair made a sound. She looked up. It wasn't a word. It was too short for a word, too quiet. But it was the first sound he'd made voluntarily, and the edge of it carried something that was almost, not quite, but almost, like someone trying not to be surprised by another person. A waiter came, took their orders, addressed the man in the wheelchair through Nia the first time, which she noticed and corrected without drama. "He can order directly," she said. The waiter flushed and turned to the man, who pointed at items on the menu with 2 fingers, steady and precise. The evening moved. The city outside the window held its glittering position. The noise from the kitchen behind them was faint now, someone else's problem, and the candle threw its small circle of warmth across the white cloth between them. Nia talked because silence didn't intimidate her, and because she'd developed over 11 years of cold-calling people who didn't want to speak to her, a particular ease with one-sided conversation. She talked about the deal she'd closed that afternoon, the product line that had taken 2 years to reformulate for the Korean market, the specific nightmare of navigating import certification as a foreign woman-owned business. She talked about it matter-of-factly, without performance, the way she'd tell a story to someone she'd known for years. The man across from her listened with his whole face, not politely, not the glazed half-attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak. He listened the way you listen when something is actually interesting to you. At some point, she realized he had a glass of water in front of him that he hadn't touched, and she asked if he wanted something else, gesturing toward the drink menu, and he shook his head once, a clean, definite motion, and she thought, he communicates, just not with words. "You're not mute, are you?" she said. It came out less like a question than an observation. He looked at her. "You chose not to speak," she said. "That's different." Something passed through his face like weather moving across a flat landscape, visible but fast, gone before she could name it. He didn't confirm, he didn't deny. "Okay," she said. "That's your business." She went back to her food. The aide arrived at 8:47. A young man, Korean, maybe 25, in a dark, slim-cut blazer that matched the two men still standing near the entrance. He came to the table quietly, bent toward the man in the wheelchair, and spoke in a low tone that Naya couldn't hear, and then straightened and turned to her. "Forgive the interruption," he said. His English was careful and good. "My name is Sung Ho. I assist Mr. Kwan." A pause, as though deciding how much. "He would like you to know that he is grateful for your intervention earlier." Nia looked at the man, Mr. Kwan, who was watching her from across the table. "He could have said that himself," she said. Sung Ho's expression shifted, not discomfort exactly, but the look of a person translating something that didn't have a clean translation. "He doesn't speak," Sung Ho said. "He doesn't choose to speak," Nia said. Sung Ho looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the man in the wheelchair, who had gone very still in the way he did when something caught his attention. The aide turned back to Nia. "He says, yes," Sung Ho said quietly. "That is the difference." The acknowledgement sat between all three of them. Nia nodded once. She took a sip of her wine. "Why is he here alone?" she asked. Not unkindly. Sung Ho glanced at his employer. Received something. A look, a micro-expression, some currency of permission she wasn't reading, and said, "Mr. Kwan has been away from public life for approximately 2 years. Tonight is his first time returning to a place of this nature." "A restaurant," Nia said. "A place where he would be seen," Sung Ho corrected carefully. She looked at the man across the table, at the stillness of him, the controlled quality of his observation, the way he held the room in his attention without calling any attention to himself. And something assembled itself in her mind. Not a complete picture. Pieces. "He wanted to see how people would treat him," she said. Sung Ho didn't answer. She nodded slowly. "And?" "He has seen," Sung Ho said. The aide stepped back. The man in the wheelchair, Mr. Kwan, looked at Nia with that same dark, awake quality of attention. The candle moved between them. "Well," she said, "I hope the data's useful to him." She picked up her fork. Sung Ho had returned to his position near the entrance when the floor manager reappeared at the table. Not alone this time. 2 members of the wait staff flanked him, and behind them, barely visible but audible, the restaurant owner. Nia had seen him earlier working the front tables, silver-haired, self-congratulatory, in the specific way of people who had made enough money to believe their opinions had become interesting. "I need to address something," the manager said, his voice carrying enough controlled volume that the nearest tables could hear without appearing to listen. Nia set down her fork. "This table," the manager continued, "was not reserved for—" He caught himself. "Reset. There seems to have been a misunderstanding about the arrangements for this evening, and I'm going to need to ask you both to—" "To what?" Nia said. "To allow us to reassign—" "He has a reservation," she said, "for this table, for this evening. The number's right here." She tapped the small card. "What part of that is a misunderstanding?" The owner stepped forward. His voice was different, smoother, older, practiced at the particular art of being dismissive, while appearing to be generous. "My dear, I understand your concern, but our establishment has certain—" "Certain what?" she said. He stopped. "Certain what?" she said again. Not loudly. The word just sat there and waited for an answer. The man in the wheelchair had not moved. He sat with both hands in his lap, watching the floor manager, the owner, and Nia with the careful attention of someone at a performance they had helped write. "I think," Nia said, setting her napkin on the table and meeting the owner's eyes with a steadiness that had taken her 11 years to cultivate, "that sitting in a wheelchair doesn't make someone less entitled to the table they reserved. And I think you know that. And I think you also know that you moved him because you made a decision about who he was the moment he rolled through your door. And I think—" She paused, let the silence do its work. "That this man has been watching every single person in this room make that exact same decision all night. And he hasn't said a single word about it." The owner's expression went through several things in quick succession. The nearest tables had gone very quiet. The manager opened his mouth. The owner put a hand on his arm. A stop, not a direction. Something was wrong. The owner could feel it without being able to name it. A quality in the room, in the two men near the entrance who were now watching the table with different attention, in the controlled stillness of the man in the wheelchair that suggested the floor had shifted in a direction nobody had mapped. He stepped back. "Enjoy your evening," he said, to neither of them specifically. He walked away. Nia looked at the man in the wheelchair. He was looking back at her. There was something in his face that hadn't been there before. Not gratitude exactly. Something rawer than that. Something that looked like a person who had not been seen clearly in a very long time and was trying to decide what to do with the experience. "You're welcome," she said quietly. She picked up her fork again. The candle burned between them. Outside, Soul held its bright and indifferent position against the glass. And inside Velour 88, in the best seat in the house, a man who had spent 2 years studying silence and a woman who had spent 11 years refusing to accept it, finished their dinner in the particular companionship of two people who have, without planning it, recognized something true in each other. Neither of them heard the car pull up outside. Neither of them saw the men who got out of it. But Sung Ho did. He straightened at the entrance, his hand moving to his ear where a small device sat, and the expression on his face changed. Not panic, but the controlled shift of a person who has been expecting something and would have preferred to be wrong. He turned toward the table, toward the man in the wheelchair, and the look he sent across the room carried in its precise economy a single piece of information. They found us. Sung Ho moved through the restaurant the way a man moves when he is trying not to run. Not fast, controlled. But everything underneath the control was wire-tight, and Nia noticed it because she'd spent enough years in rooms where tension had to be managed quietly to recognize when someone was managing it. She watched him cross the floor from the entrance with the particular walk of a person carrying information they wish they didn't have, and she set her fork down before he reached the table because something in his face told her the meal was over whether she'd finished it or not. He bent to the man in the wheelchair, to Mr. Kwon, and spoke in Korean, low and fast, the kind of sentences that had been compressed down to their necessary bones. She caught nothing of the language, but she caught everything of the tone, and the tone said, "We have a problem, and the problem is here." Kwon's response was a single look toward the entrance. Not fast, deliberate. The look of a man taking inventory before deciding how to spend it. Sung Ho straightened. His hands were very still at his sides, which Nia had already learned meant the opposite of calm. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "I would ask that you return to your original table now." "What's happening?" she said. "Please, what's happening?" He looked at her the way people look when they've been given an order they know won't work. "There are individuals arriving who present a potential concern. Mr. Kwon's security." "His security." She looked at the two men near the entrance, who were no longer performing casual. They were standing with the weight shifted forward, shoulders angled, watching the door with the quality of dogs that have heard something. "He has a security team, Ms. Brooks, and they're worried." "I am asking you," Sung Ho said quietly, "as a courtesy, to please move away from this table." She looked at Kwon. He was already looking at her. That same level of attention, the same complete stillness. But something had shifted in the quality of it. He wasn't watching the room anymore. He was watching her. Like a question he was waiting to see answered. She picked up her wine glass, took one unhurried sip, and set it back down. "I'll move when I feel like moving," she said. Sung Ho closed his eyes briefly, opened them, looked at his employer with an expression that said, "I tried." Kwon made the small motion with his right hand, 2 fingers, a slight rotation, a command in a language built from years of shared shorthand, and Sung Ho straightened and went back to the entrance without further argument. Nia looked across the candle at the man who had not spoken a single word in the 2 hours she'd been sitting with him. "You want me to leave too?" she said. Not a question. He didn't respond the way she expected. His jaw tightened, which was different from the contained stillness he'd held all night. A fracture. Small. Human. "Too bad, but," she said. "But they said." The men who came through the door of Velour 88 at 9/11 on a Friday evening were not the kind of men who needed to announce themselves. There were 4 of them, and they moved with the specific ease of people who had never had to wonder whether a room would accommodate them, because rooms always had. Not large, most of them. The one in front was actually lean, narrow-shouldered, wearing a pale gray suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His dark hair swept back with the precision of someone who made a point of his appearance because his appearance was a message. Late 40s. A face that had been handsome and had stayed handsome in the way of faces that have never suffered a consequence they couldn't buy their way out of. Park Do-yoon. Nia didn't know the name yet. She learned it later. What she knew in the moment was the way the 2 men at the entrance responded. A micro step back, a recalibration, the brief controlled renegotiation of people who knew they were outnumbered in ways that didn't show. Park walked through the restaurant like he owned the air in it. The 3 men behind him fanned out with the rehearsed naturalness of people who had done this in enough rooms that it required no discussion. The owner appeared from somewhere near the kitchen corridor, silver-haired and suddenly less self-congratulatory, and made a move toward Park that had apology already written into it. Park didn't look at him. His eyes swept the room. Not the walls, not the decor, not the window view. The tables, the faces, the particular geometry of occupied space, until they landed on the corner table by the window, on the man in the wheelchair, and stopped. Something happened to his face then, not surprise. Something uglier than surprise. Satisfaction, the specific kind that comes from a search ending exactly where you expected it to. "Well," Park said, in Korean, loud enough to carry. Sung-ho, standing 6 feet away, went absolutely rigid. The translation came later from the aide's careful, controlled recounting, but the tone needed no translation. It was the tone of a man who has arrived at a confrontation he has been rehearsing. He crossed to the table. He pulled out a chair without being offered one, turned it around, and sat on it backwards with his arms crossed over the back, the way someone sits when they want to perform a kind of casual dominance. He looked at the man in the wheelchair for a long moment. Then he looked at Nia. "Who are you?" he asked in English, which surprised her slightly. "Who are you?" she said. His mouth pulled at the corner. Not quite a smile, not quite contempt, some compound of both. He returned his attention to Kwon and spoke again in Korean. Longer this time. And whatever he said changed the temperature in a 2-table radius, because Sung-ho made a movement toward the table that one of Park's men stopped simply by stepping into his path. Nia looked at Kwon. He hadn't moved. The stillness had taken on a different quality, denser somehow, like the stillness before a structure fails. "Sung-ho," she said. "What is he saying?" Sung-ho was watching Park with the specific concentration of a person translating and calculating simultaneously. "He is—" a pause. "He is expressing his opinion that Mr. Kwon's position has become untenable, that in Mr. Kwon's absence, certain arrangements have been revised. He is suggesting that tonight is an opportunity to formalize those revisions." "What does that mean?" she said. "It means," Sung-ho said carefully, "that he believes Mr. Kwon has no power left to lose." Park spoke again. One of his men produced something, a phone, screen facing Kwon, and held it at table level. Nia couldn't see what was on it from where she sat, but she saw Kwon's eyes move to it and stay there for exactly 4 seconds before returning to Park's face. 4 seconds. Then back to Park. And nothing in Kwon's expression confirmed anything, which seemed to agitate Park more than any reaction would have. He leaned forward. His voice dropped, which made it somehow more aggressive rather than less. The controlled volume of a man who knows the room is listening and wants to demonstrate that he doesn't need to perform for it. He said something short. 3 words, maybe 4. Sung-ho's breath caught. Small sound, barely there. "What?" Nia said. Sung-ho didn't answer immediately. "Sung-ho," he said. The aide stopped, collected himself. He said, "The chair suits you." The table went quiet. Nia felt something move through her chest. Not slow, not measured, the fast and immediate response of a body that has been struck before it had time to decide whether to brace. She looked at Park Do-yoon at the pale gray suit and the swept-back hair and the quality of enjoyment sitting in his face like something he wasn't bothering to conceal. "Say that again?" she said. Park looked at her. His English, when he used it, was accent-heavy but precise. "This does not involve you, woman. You made it involve me when you sat at this table without an invitation." One of his men shifted his weight. Park's eyes stayed on her, recalibrating again. She could see it, the small adjustment of someone who had expected either deference or silence and received neither. "You don't know what you're sitting next to," Park said. "I'm sitting next to a man who has better manners than you do," she said, which is apparently a low bar, but here we are. Something in Park's face went flat. The performance of casual dominance had a finite amount of tolerance for being pushed back against, and she had just used some of it. He turned back to Quan and spoke again, longer now, and what came out of it felt different. Less performance, more intent. His voice had shed the entertainment quality it had carried since he walked in. What was underneath it was harder and older. Sung-ho translated in fragments, barely above a whisper, turned slightly toward Nia. He is saying that the families have met, that decisions have been made about the distribution of assets, operations, territories, that Mr. Kwan's associates, those who remained, have been given a choice, that several of them made the choice Park preferred. A pause. He is saying that Mr. Kwan has been gone long enough that coming back is no longer possible, that the structure doesn't exist anymore to come back to. Nia watched Kwan's face during this. She watched for the thing that should have been there, the flinch, the resistance, the anger. And she found none of it. What she found instead was something that disturbed her more, recognition. Like a man listening to confirmation of something he already knew, turning it over to see which side it was on. "Is any of it true?" she said quietly to Sung-ho. The aide was quiet for a long moment. "Some of it," he said. Park stood up. He did it slowly, with the theatrical patience of someone who wanted the action to land. The full height of him over the table, over Kwan, the deliberate construction of physical hierarchy in a room full of witnesses. He straightened his jacket, looked down at the wheelchair with the expression of a man looking at something that has already been decided. 2 years, he said, in English, loudly enough now that the nearest 3 tables could no longer pretend they weren't listening. 2 years you hide, like an old dog that goes away to die. His English degraded slightly under the emotion in it, the grammar loosening. And now you come back here, to eat dinner. He said the last 2 words with a contempt that could have been used as a weapon. While your people choose new loyalties, new futures, while your enemies grow and your empire becomes... He made a gesture with his hand, dismissive, fingers opening and closing. Historical. One of the nearby tables had gone fully silent. A woman 3 tables away had her hand near her mouth. Park looked at the wheelchair again. You should have stayed hidden. Nia put her hands flat on the table. Are you done? She said. Park looked at her. Because you've been talking for about 10 minutes, she said, and the only thing I've heard is a man who needs a wheelchair-bound dinner guest to feel powerful. She kept her voice level, which cost something. She could feel her pulse in her throat, the specific rhythm of a body that wants to move and is being held to stillness. That's not strength. That's the absence of it, wearing a nice suit. The room was extremely quiet. Park Do-yoon looked at Nia Brooks across the candle and the white cloth and 2 years of carefully constructed political architecture, and his face went through something that wasn't controlled, a flash of something genuine and ugly. One of his men took a step toward the table. Sung-ho moved. He was between the man and the table before the step finished, and the 2 men stood a foot apart with the specific charged quality of a physics problem waiting to resolve, and the restaurant owner appeared again from somewhere, his face bloodless, his hands open and empty at his sides, uselessly. Park held up one hand. His man stopped. Park looked at Nia for a long moment. Then he looked at Kwan, who had not moved, who had not spoken, who had watched the entire exchange with that same unnerving quality of total, documented attention. Enjoy your dinner, Park said. He turned and walked back through the restaurant the way he'd come in. Not quickly, not theatrically, just moving, his men falling in behind him with practiced ease. The owner stepped out of his path. The nearest table's occupants found their water glasses extremely interesting. The door opened and the city swallowed them. The room breathed. Nia realized her hands were shaking slightly under the table. She pressed them flat against her thighs and held them there until the shaking stopped, which took longer than she would have preferred. Sung-ho came to the table. He looked at his employer first. A check, quick and thorough. The way someone looks at a structure after a tremor to see if anything shifted, and then at Nia. "You should go," he said. "Ms. Brooks, genuinely. What you did just now was—" "I know what it was," she said. "You don't know who he is," Sung-ho said. "Who Park is." "I don't need to know who Park is," she said. "I know what he was doing." Sung-ho's jaw moved. "Park Do-yoon runs the second largest." He stopped, looked at his employer, some silent consultation, turned back to her. "He is not someone who accepts public challenges gracefully." "Then he should have better manners," she said. "Ms. Brooks." Sung-ho. She looked at him squarely. "Is Mr. Kwan in danger?" The aide was quiet. "Right now, in this restaurant tonight, is he in danger?" "There are—" Sung-ho measured his words. "There are people outside whose intentions we are currently assessing." "So yes," she said. He didn't answer, which was the same as yes. She looked at Kwan. He was looking at her. 2 years of self-imposed silence, 11 years of self-constructed resistance, and across a table in a restaurant that hadn't wanted either of them, they looked at each other with the specific clarity of two people who have just been through something together and are deciding independently what it means. "What do you need?" she said. Kwan's hand moved on the armrest. Slowly, deliberately. The same two-finger gesture she'd seen him use with Sung-ho, but oriented toward her this time. Sung-ho leaned down, listened, straightened. "He says," Sung-ho said, and something in the aide's voice had shifted, some professional remove replaced by something rawer. "He says you should not have to need anything, that this is not your situation." "I'm already in his situation," she said. Park looked right at me. "I'm in it." She watched Kwan's face when Sung-ho relayed this. Watched the thing that moved through it. Not the flash of weather she'd seen earlier, something different. Something that took longer. Something that looked like a man reconsidering a wall he'd built very carefully and was now standing on the wrong side of. "Tell him," she said, "that I didn't sit down at his table because I knew who he was. I sat down because of how someone treated him when they thought he was nobody." She paused. "And that hasn't changed." Sung-ho translated, quietly. The silence that followed was specific and loaded. And then Kwan did something he had not done once in the entire evening. He spoke. Not to Sung-ho, not in the direction of anyone else. He turned his head and looked directly at Nia Brooks and said, in English that was accented but absolutely clear, 2 words, "Thank you." The sound of his voice was low and rough, the voice of someone who had kept it locked for long enough that using it felt like opening a door that had been sealed. It was 2 words. It took maybe 2 seconds. It changed the entire weight of the room. Nia looked at him, really looked, at the scar tissue hidden under the jaw, at the hands that had been so still all evening, at the person behind the stillness who had watched everyone in the room show him exactly what they were made of and had said nothing, cataloged everything, and waited. "You're welcome," she said. And then the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a fluctuation, a complete and immediate darkness. The candle between them, the only light left in the room, throwing its small orange circle across the white cloth, across their faces, as every head in the restaurant turned toward the windows and saw, in the parking structure visible across the street, a systematic series of lights extinguishing in sequence, floor by floor, moving downward. Someone at a nearby table made a sound. A chair scraped. Sung-ho already had his phone to his ear. His face in the candlelight had gone the color of concrete. He spoke 3 words in Korean, sharp, clipped, the compressed language of emergency, and then listened, and the listening was the worst part because of what it did to his expression. He lowered the phone. He looked at Kwan. "They cut the block," he said. "The exterior cameras, the parking structure, the building feed." A pause. "All simultaneously." Kwan's jaw set. One motion, precise. He reached for the joystick on his wheelchair. "They're not here to talk this time," Sung-ho said. The candle flickered between them, once, as though agreeing. The darkness lasted 9 seconds. Nia counted them without meaning to, the kind of counting a body does when it's trying to organize itself against something it doesn't understand. 1, 2. The candle between them throwing its small, inadequate light. 3, 4. The sound of chairs scraping, someone's glass hitting the floor and not breaking. 5, 6. A woman somewhere behind her making a sound that was trying not to be a scream. 7, 8. Sung-ho's voice in Korean, clipped and directional. 9. The emergency lighting came on. Not the restaurant's warm amber, something harsher, utilitarian, the kind of light that reveals rather than flatters. It came from strips along the floor and a single unit above the bar, and what it illuminated was a room full of people who had been performing comfort and were now performing something raw and less practiced. Kwan had not moved. This was the thing she kept returning to in the seconds after, that while every other person in the room had lurched or gasped or reached for something, the man in the wheelchair had simply sat, perfectly still, in the emergency light and watched the room reorganize itself around the new reality, like he'd been waiting for exactly this to happen and was now simply present for it. Sung-ho was at the table. "We move," he said. "Now." "Where?" Nia said. "Back corridor. There's a service exit to the—" "Is it clear?" Sung-ho's jaw tightened. "Ji-won is checking." "So you don't know?" "Ms. Brooks, I need you to—" "I'm not going anywhere until I know it's clear," she said, "and neither should he." Kwan made the motion with his hand. Sung-ho bent down, listened, straightened. His expression, when he turned back to her, had something in it she hadn't expected. Agreement. "He says you're right," Sung-ho said. Flat. Like the words cost something. She nodded. "Then we wait 30 seconds, and you hear from Ji-won." The 30 seconds were the longest 30 seconds Nia had spent in recent memory, and she had spent the last 3 years navigating international trade negotiations that ran 18 hours in conference rooms with no windows, so she had a basis for comparison. Around them, the restaurant owner was moving through the room with his hands up in the pacifying gesture of a man who understood that his evening had entirely escaped his control. A waiter was guiding 2 elderly women toward the front entrance. The men at the bar had stood up and were doing the specific thing men do in uncertain situations, taking up space and watching the door and pretending this constituted a plan. Sung-ho's phone buzzed. He looked at it, looked at Kwan. "Service corridor is clear to the loading dock. 2 vehicles are coming around." "Parks people?" Nia said. "Ours," Sung-ho said, and there was something in the way he said it, a possessive that was also a declaration, a small signal of where his loyalty had decided to plant its feet. Kwan moved the wheelchair forward. Sung-ho held up a hand. "The corridor is narrow. The chair—" "He knows his chair better than you do," Nia said. She stood, pushed her chair in with the automatic tidiness of someone who did it without thinking, looked at the candlestick on the table. Still burning, this small flame holding itself upright in the emergency light like it had decided to be stubborn about it. And then she turned and followed Kwan toward the back of the restaurant, and Sung-ho fell in behind her, and the 2 men from the entrance materialized from somewhere to their left, and the 6 of them moved through the kitchen door into the noise and heat of the service area. The kitchen was chaos of the organized variety, the kind that happens when a professional environment gets an emergency signal, and the professionals in it are trying to decide which protocols apply. 2 line cooks had stopped working and were standing near the far wall. A prep cook was still chopping, mechanically, like stopping would require acknowledging something she wasn't ready to acknowledge. The head chef, a broad-shouldered Korean man in his 50s, white coat, the bearing of someone who ran this room like a military unit, stepped into their path and then stopped when he saw Sung-ho. Something passed between them. Recognition. The chef stepped back and gestured toward the far door. "You know him," Nia said. "Mr. Kwan has interests in several establishments in this district," Sung-ho said. "He owns this restaurant." Sung-ho said nothing, which was the same as yes. She processed this while navigating around a stainless steel prep table, following Kwan's wheelchair through the corridor between the stations. He moved through his own kitchen without looking at it, without the orientation of a visitor, the slight lean into a turn he knew was coming, the adjustment before a threshold she couldn't see yet. He'd been here before. He'd been here many times before. The service corridor was concrete and fluorescent, narrow enough that the wheelchair left maybe 8 inches on either side. It smelled like industrial cleaning solution and the accumulated cold of a walk-in unit somewhere behind the wall. Their footsteps were loud in it, too loud. Every sound felt like it was being broadcast. Sung-ho was on his phone again, walking just behind Kwan, speaking in the fast compressed Korean of someone managing multiple simultaneous problems. One of the other men, the one she'd started mentally calling the quiet one because he had not said a single word the entire evening, moved ahead to the exit door and pressed himself to the wall beside it, hand on the handle, waiting. Nia walked just behind and to the left of Kwan's chair. She didn't know why she'd positioned herself there, some instinct she didn't examine. She could see his right hand on the joystick control, the knuckles, the tendons. He was gripping it with slightly more force than usual, the only tell he'd given. The quiet one put his hand to his ear, listened, gave a short nod. He pushed the door open. Well, the loading dock was cold. The kind of cold that comes off concrete and metal at 9 in the evening in October. Specific and aggressive. The kind that finds the spaces in your clothing immediately. Nia felt it hit her neck and shoulders, and she didn't react to it because there wasn't space in the moment for reacting to cold. 2 black vehicles were backed up to the dock, engines running. A third man she hadn't seen before was standing between them, speaking into a phone, and when he saw Kwan, he ended the call and came forward. "Chairman," he said. The word landed in the cold air between them and did something to the composition of the moment, shifted the weight of it, redistributed something. Nia watched the 2 men she'd come through the kitchen with respond to the word with a kind of settling, like people who had been holding their breath and had received permission to stop. The new man, older, 50s, a face like weather-worked stone, bent toward Kwan and spoke quietly. Kwan listened. His response was brief, gestural. 2 motions with his right hand that she was beginning to read the way you begin to read someone's handwriting after seeing it enough. This one meant proceed. This one meant wait. "Ms. Brooks," Sung-ho came to her side. "There's a vehicle that can take you to your hotel. We'd like to—" "What's happening?" she said. "We're relocating Mr. Kwan to a—" "Not what you're doing," she said. "What is happening? What was the lights? What is Park doing?" Sung-ho looked at his employer. That consultation again. The look, the fractional response, the permission or denial coming back in some currency she still couldn't fully read. "Park," Sung-ho said carefully, "has been operating under the assumption that Mr. Kwan's return to public life tonight was impulsive, emotional, a mistake." He paused. "He has been acting on that assumption since approximately 7 this evening." "Is the assumption wrong?" she said. Sung-ho looked at her steadily. "Mr. Kwan has been planning his return for 14 months. She let that sit for a moment. The cold worked at her neck. One of the vehicle's exhaust made a white cloud in the dark behind them. "The restaurant," she said slowly, "being treated the way he was treated tonight was anticipated," Sung-ho said. "He wanted to see it." "He needed to document it," Sung-ho said. "There's a difference. Every interaction tonight, the host, the floor manager, the owner, Park's arrival, Park's words, all of it has been recorded." He touched his ear. "The lapel of his jacket contains a camera and audio unit. The 2 men at the entrance have been transmitting since 9 o'clock. She stood in the cold and let this rearrange itself in her mind. The stillness of him. The complete controlled stillness that she'd read as something else, as containment, as grief, as the practiced patience of a man with nothing to prove. And it was those things, she thought, but it was also something more deliberate than she'd understood. "He knew Park would come," she said. "He made sure Park would know he was here," Sung-ho said. "He baited him." "He created an opportunity," Sung-ho said, with the careful diction of someone who had thought about word choice. She looked at Kwan. He was looking at her. In the cold and the dark of the loading dock, In the exhaust light and the October air, he looked at her with the same quality of attention he'd had across the candlelit table, and she understood, standing in this dock, that it was the same attention, that it had always been the same attention, not calculating, not performed, but the total focused presence of a man who had learned to communicate without sound and therefore communicated with everything else. "You could have told me," she said. He didn't look away. "When I sat down," she said, "you could have—" Sung-ho could have said something, that you weren't just a man being treated badly at a restaurant. "You weren't just a woman defending a stranger," Sung-ho said quietly. "Would knowing have changed what you did?" She didn't answer, because the answer was she didn't know, and she was honest enough with herself to let it stand there. A sound from above them, from the street level, from somewhere on the block, sharp and percussive. Not an explosion, but adjacent to one. The sound of something structural giving way or being forced. Everyone on the dock oriented toward it. The older man with the stone face said something in Korean, fast. Sung-ho grabbed her arm. Not rough, but definite. "In the vehicle. Now." What was in the vehicle? The inside of the car smelled like leather, and something mechanical and slightly antiseptic, the specific interior smell of vehicles that are maintained rather than used. Kwan's chair was folded into the back with practiced efficiency by the quiet one, who then took the passenger seat. Sung-ho sat beside Nia in the middle row. Kwan sat in the space behind the driver, where a seat had been removed to accommodate him, and he sat with the stillness he'd held all evening, but there was something different in the set of his shoulders now. Not tension, not relief. Something more complicated. The car moved. "Someone needs to explain to me what just happened," Nia said. Sung-ho's phone was in his hand. He was reading something on the screen. His face gave her nothing useful. "Sung-ho." "One moment." "Not one moment," she said. "Shao, now. I was in that restaurant. Someone threatened that man to his face, and I'm pretty sure they threatened me by proximity, and I'd like to know what I'm in." Sung-ho lowered the phone, looked at her. "Park's men attempted to access the restaurant's lower level, the kitchen corridor." A pause. "They were anticipated." "By who?" "By people Mr. Kwan placed there 6 days ago." The car moved through Seoul traffic, the ordinary, oblivious traffic of a city on a Friday night, headlights and neon, someone's music faintly audible as they sat at a red light. And inside this vehicle, in this little sealed world moving through the middle of it all, Nia sat with the understanding that she had walked into something that had been in motion for 14 months, and she had been, in it, simultaneously irrelevant and essential, and she was still working out how both of those things could be true at once. "Was anyone hurt?" she said. "Not our people," Sung-ho said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at his phone again. "Park's team encountered," he chose his words, "complications. In the corridor. There were 4 of them. 2 are currently being held, 2 left the premises." "Held by who?" "By people whose role tonight was to ensure that Mr. Kwan's return was not interrupted." "Police?" she said. Sung-ho said nothing. "Not police," she said. A pause that meant no. She looked at Kwan. He was looking out the window at the city he'd apparently been preparing to retake for 14 months. His profile in the passing light was sharp and quiet, that same carved quality she'd noticed in the restaurant, and she thought, this man has been planning while everyone assumed he was broken. He went into a room where everyone expected to see a helpless person, and he sat and he watched and he recorded, and he let the people around him prove exactly what they were. "The owner of the restaurant," she said. "He knows Kwan owns it." "Yes," Sung-ho said, and he still seated him at the worst table, attempted to have him removed, cooperated with Park when Park arrived. Sung-ho's mouth was a flat line. "Yes." "That's on the recording." "Everything is on the recording." She processed this. The owner's face when he'd backed down from her shibashin. Not from her, she understood now, but from something in the room he'd only half sensed, some shift in the weight of things he couldn't identify. He had been recorded degrading someone he financially depended on, in a room that person secretly controlled, and he hadn't known it, and now he did, or would. And that understanding must have been landing somewhere in the universe at this exact moment, like a very large and very targeted piece of falling weight. The car turned. Nia didn't know this part of the city. She looked at the streets going by, at the ordinary Friday night of them, restaurants and people on phones and a couple arguing under a convenience store awning, and she felt the unreality of the evening sitting on her chest like something physical. "Where are we going?" she said. "Mr. Kwan's residence," Sung-ho said. "There is—" He paused, looked at his employer, received something, turned back. "There is a briefing that needs to happen. Tonight. Mr. Kwan would like you present." She looked at him. "Why?" Sung-ho didn't answer immediately. When he did, the words came out with something that might have been reluctance or might have been precision. She couldn't separate them. "Because you are now part of what happened tonight," he said, "and what happened tonight is not finished." The residence was not what she expected, which she acknowledged later said something about her assumptions. Not a compound, not the architectural performance of power she'd half constructed in her mind. An apartment building in a quieter district, older architecture, the kind of building that had been expensive once and remained expensive without advertising it. The lobby was plain stone and low light. A man she hadn't seen before was waiting at the elevator. They went up to the 14th floor. The apartment was large but not extravagant, the kind of space that had been furnished by someone with specific taste rather than someone trying to demonstrate wealth. Dark wood. Books in 3 languages along one wall. Windows that looked out over a district of the city she didn't recognize, the lights of it arranged in their Friday night patterns below. Sung-ho showed her to a chair. Someone brought water, and she drank it without registering the action. Kwan positioned his wheelchair at the end of a low table. The older man from the loading dock, the one with the stone face, whom she'd learned was named Director O, sat across from him with a laptop open, and 2 other men she hadn't seen before came in from a side room and stood near the wall. What followed was not a briefing she was included in. It was a briefing she witnessed, which was a different thing. It was conducted mostly in Korean, with Sung-ho providing translations at irregular intervals, and it moved fast and covered ground. She couldn't always follow, but what she assembled from it was this. Park Do-yoon had spent 22 months consolidating territory and alliances under the assumption that Kwan was permanently out of the picture. He had been methodical and patient, and according to Director O's account, increasingly reckless in the last 6 months, as the assumption had solidified into certainty. Recklessness meant documentation. Documentation meant evidence. Evidence had been accumulating in ways Park hadn't anticipated because Park had stopped looking for surveillance from a man he believed was in a wheelchair in a private residence somewhere, unable to act. 3 of Kwan's former lieutenants had changed allegiance. Director O named them. Kwan's hand moved, that same 2-finger gesture, deliberate, and Director O made a note. 2 had not changed allegiance. They were, according to Director O, currently positioned at specific locations in the city, waiting. "Waiting for what?" Nia said. Everyone in the room looked at her. She'd spoken without deciding to. Sung-ho translated. Kwan looked at her, made a motion. Sung-ho said, "For tonight's documentation to be distributed." "To who?" Another motion from Kwan. Sung-ho. "To the relevant financial institutions and to the investigative division of the National Police Agency. We have a contact there who has been expecting a package." She sat back. "The police?" "Not all of them," Sung-ho said carefully. "1 division, 1 contact, verified over 18 months. He's been working with a police contact for 18 months. He has been building a case, Sung-ho said, for 18 months. She looked at the man at the end of the table, at Jae-hyun Kwan, who had sat in a restaurant and let people treat him as though he was nothing and recorded every moment of it, and who had been doing a version of this for over a year and a half, while everyone who wanted him gone believed they'd already won. "The assassination attempt," she said. 2 years ago. Sung-ho looked at Kwan. Kwan's chin moved, barely. "He was shot," Sung-ho said. "Twice. He was shielding his younger sister, Min-seo. She was unharmed." A pause. "He was not, for some time, expected to recover the use of his lower body. The recovery has been longer than hoped, and not complete." She absorbed this. "Park ordered it," she said. Sung-ho didn't answer, which meant yes. "And the evidence you have is part of what will be distributed tonight," Sung-ho said. The room was quiet for a moment. Director O was typing. One of the men by the wall took a call and stepped out. The city held its indifferent light outside the windows. Nia thought about the restaurant, about the candle in the window and the host's dismissive grip on the wheelchair handles and the owner's practiced condescension, and Park leaning over the table with his pale gray suit and his English that got looser when he was angry. She thought about Kwan sitting through all of it, absorbing every insult, documenting every piece of it, not because he had to, but because he had decided that when he came back, he would come back with more than force. The recording from tonight, she said. The insults, the owner, Park's speech. She paused. That's going to the police too? The elements relevant to ongoing criminal conduct, Sung-ho said. Yes. And the rest of it? Sung-ho looked at Kwan. Kwan's eyes were on her. He made a motion she hadn't seen before. Different from the procedural shorthand, something with more weight to it. The rest, Sung-ho said slowly, he considers a private matter. She nodded, looked at the table, looked up. What do you need from me? Director O looked up from the laptop. Sung-ho translated for Kwan. The room waited. Kwan's voice, when it came, was the same as it had been in the restaurant. Low, rough with disuse, the voice of a door being opened carefully. But it was longer this time. Several sentences. She watched his face as he spoke, and the face was doing something it hadn't done before. Something open and effortful, the look of a man spending something he doesn't have much of. Sung-ho listened, turned to her. He says, Sung-ho began, and there was something in the aide's voice she hadn't heard before, something softened, that he doesn't need anything from you, that you have already given more than he could have anticipated, that he is asking you to stay, not for the operation, not because you're a witness, not because of what Park saw tonight, but because Sung-ho paused, not for translation, for something else. Because in 2 years, this is the first evening he has spent in a room with someone who looked at him and saw a person rather than an asset or an obstacle, and he is not yet ready for that to end. The room was very quiet. Director O was looking at his screen. The man by the wall was looking at the wall. Only Sung-ho was looking at her, and only because he'd just said the words and someone had to see if they landed. They landed. She looked at Kwan. He looked back. The city below them held its position, indifferent and illuminated, doing what cities do. Going on, always going on, regardless of what people inside buildings decided about each other. Okay, she said. A single word. She'd made larger decisions in her life with more ceremony and gotten them wrong. This one, she said simply, and it was the right weight. Kwan looked at her for another moment. Then he turned back to Director O and made the two-finger motion, and the room resumed its work. But across the low table she saw his right hand, resting on the armrest of the wheelchair, and the grip on it, that slightly too tight grip she'd noticed in the kitchen corridor, had released. The fingers were open. The knuckles were just knuckles again. It was 11:40 when Director O looked up from the laptop and said something that made every person in the room stop what they were doing. Sung-ho went still. The man by the wall walked back in from wherever he'd been and stood in the doorway. Nia looked around the room and felt the shift before she understood it. The specific quality of air in a space when multiple people receive the same piece of information and it is not good. Sung-ho, she said. He held up one finger. First time he'd done that to her all evening. She let it go because his face told her it was serious. He crossed to Kwan, bent down, spoke. She watched Kwan receive whatever it was, watched his face, which she was getting better at reading, move through something precise and layered. Not shock. Not the shock of unexpected news. The shock of expected news arriving earlier than planned. What happened? She said. Sung-ho straightened. His voice was controlled and careful. Park is not at the locations we anticipated. His vehicles left the restaurant district 40 minutes ago, and our surveillance placed them heading east. He paused. They are not east. They were not heading east. They turned the surveillance. He knew he was being tracked. He knew some of what we had, Sung-ho said. Not all, but enough to... Where is he? The pause before the answer was the longest pause in the room all evening. The hospital, Sung-ho said, where Min Seo is currently receiving treatment for her condition. The condition, which Sung-ho had mentioned once, briefly, as the reason she remained hospitalized, was a nerve disorder that had developed in the months after the assassination attempt. The medical literature complicated and the prognosis uncertain, and she had been in a private facility in eastern Seoul for the last 7 months. Nia looked at Kwon. His face had closed. Everything she'd learned to read in it, the micro-expressions, the weather-moving fast quality of his emotional responses, all of it had gone somewhere interior and locked. What remained was the stillness she'd seen at the beginning of the evening, in the restaurant, before she'd understood what lived behind it. But it was different now. The stillness at the restaurant had been controlled. This was the stillness of something that had stopped, because everything underneath it had just turned completely and irrevocably toward a single point. He moved the wheelchair to the window. Just that. He went to the window and he looked out at the city, and his hand on the joystick was white at the knuckles. And nobody in the room said anything, because there was nothing in the room's vocabulary for this moment. Nia stood up. She walked to the window and she stood beside him. Not in front, not behind, beside. And she looked out at the same city he was looking at, and she did not say anything wise or useful because there wasn't anything wise or useful. And she understood that what the moment required was not words but presence, the simple physical fact of another person choosing to stand in the same place. After a long time, Kwon spoke. 3 words. In Korean. Sung-ho, from across the room, translated. We go now, he said. The vehicles left the underground garage at 11:43. No sirens, no speed. 2 black cars moving through Seoul traffic with the calibrated patience of people who understood that attracting attention right now was the same as losing. Kwon sat in the back of the first vehicle behind the driver, and Nia sat beside him because nobody had told her not to and she hadn't asked for permission. Sung-ho was in the passenger seat with both phones active, one at his ear and one on his knee, and Director Oh had stayed behind at the apartment to manage the distribution of the evidence package, the recordings, the financial documentation, the 18 months of assembled proof, which was now either going to matter or it was going to be too late for mattering. She didn't know which. She suspected nobody in the car knew which. The city moved past the windows. She watched it without seeing it. Her mind kept returning to the same 3 words. Sung-ho's translation of what Kwon had said at the window, flat and without inflection because the original had been said without inflection, the words of a man who had moved past the part where emotion was useful. We go now. 3 words that contained everything. The decision, the direction, the acceptance of what it would cost, compressed down to the minimum because there wasn't room for anything else. She looked at Kwon's hands, right hand on the armrest, not the joystick. The chair was folded in the back. He was in the vehicle seat, and his hands were in his lap the way they'd been all evening, but the quality of their stillness had changed. These weren't resting hands. These were hands being held deliberately quiet. How far is the hospital? She said. 14 minutes, Sung-ho said, not taking the phone from his ear. What's the plan? He didn't answer immediately. The phone at his ear crackled with something she couldn't hear. Sung-ho. He lowered the phone. We have 2 men already at the facility. Park's vehicles arrived 9 minutes ago. 3 men went inside. Park stayed in the car. He stayed outside, she said. Why? Because Park doesn't take risks with his own body if he can avoid it, Sung-ho said. He sends people. To do what? To Min Seo? The name felt unfamiliar in her mouth. She'd heard it once, briefly, and now it was the center of everything. Sung-ho's jaw worked. To demonstrate. To Mr. Kwon. He paused. Park needs Kwon to make a mistake. He needs him to come out of hiding and react rather than act. He's been trying to create a situation that forces it. He succeeded, she said. Yes. She looked at the back of Sung-ho's head. Is that what Kwon is doing? Making a mistake? A long pause. One of the phones buzzed. Sung-ho looked at the screen, his profile sharp against the passing streetlights. I have been with Mr. Kwon for 9 years, Sung-ho said. I have seen him make mistakes. I know what they look like. He didn't finish the sentence immediately. Let 2 seconds go by. This doesn't look like one. She turned to Quan. He was already looking at her. In the moving dark of the vehicle, with the city lights crossing his face in irregular intervals, he looked like something being revealed and concealed repeatedly. The scar tissue at the jaw, the depth of the eyes, the absolute absence of panic in them. She'd spent the evening reading that stillness as strength. She still believed that. But she understood now what the strength was made of. Not the absence of feeling, but the decision, made and remade, to keep the feeling below the surface where it couldn't be used against him. She's okay, Nia said. Not a question, a commitment, the only useful thing she had. Quan held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then he looked at the windshield. They stopped 2 blocks from the hospital facility. Not at it, 2 blocks from it, in the shadow of a parking structure, where a man Nia hadn't seen before was waiting on the sidewalk with his hands in his jacket and his collar up against the cold. Sung-ho was out of the car before it fully stopped. He and the new man conferred for 30 seconds, rapid and low, and Nia watched through the glass. She could read the new man's body language, if not his words. The tightness of the shoulders, the way he kept glancing toward the east end of the block. The small aborted gesture that meant something was not where they'd expected it to be. She got out. The cold took her immediately, same cold as the loading dock. The specific October cold of this city that had no interest in the problems of the people walking through it. Quan's chair had been unfolded by the quiet one, who worked with the practiced speed of someone who had done this in worse circumstances. Quan transferred from the car seat with a controlled efficiency she'd watched enough times now to recognize. The way he managed his body's limitations with the same calibrated patience he managed everything else. No frustration in it, no performance, just the mechanics of a body doing what it could. She came alongside him. "Tell me what I can do," she said. He looked up at her. Then he made a motion to Sung-ho, longer than usual, more complex, the shorthand expanding under pressure. Sung-ho listened, turned to her. He says, "You should stay with the vehicle, that what happens in the next—" "No," she said. Sung-ho blinked. "Whatever you were going to say after that," she said. "No." A silence. Cold air. Somewhere a block over, the ambient noise of a hospital district at midnight. The faint specific sound of a city that doesn't fully sleep. Quan made another motion. Different. Sung-ho's eyebrows shifted. Surprise, or something near it. He says... Sung-ho stopped, tried again. He says you sound like someone who has made this decision before. "I make this decision every time someone tells me where I'm allowed to stand," she said. Sung-ho translated. Quan looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face. Not weather this time, not fast. Something slower, something that came from somewhere deeper and took longer to surface. He turned to Sung-ho and spoke 3 words. "She comes," Sung-ho said. The facility was private, the kind of private that money builds to be invisible, tucked between 2 older buildings on a quiet eastern street, its entrance marked only by a small brushed steel sign and an intercom panel. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place that wanted to look like nothing. The 2 men already inside had disabled the exterior camera at the staff entrance 4 minutes before they arrived, which Sung-ho explained as they moved down the side street. A 3rd man, one of the ones from the restaurant's entrance, was holding the staff door from inside. Sung-ho looked at the wheelchair, looked at the staff entrance. The threshold was narrow, but passable. He measured it without comment, and Quan moved through it without asking for help, and they were inside. The interior hallway was white and fluorescent and smelled like every hospital hallway everywhere. Antiseptic layered over something organic that the antiseptic couldn't quite cover. Quiet in the way of places that are designed to contain sound. A trolley sat against the far wall, abandoned. Somewhere deeper in the building, a monitor beeped its patient rhythm. One of the interior men, young, tight-faced, the specific tension of someone who has been waiting in a tense place for too long, came forward and spoke to Sung-ho rapidly. She caught the floor number. 5th. And then a room number, and then a word she didn't know but that made Sung-ho's head drop forward by 1 centimeter. A gesture she'd come to understand meant bad news being absorbed. "What?" she said. "Park's men are on the 5th floor," Sung-ho said. "Room 512 is Min Seo's room. They are not inside it. They are—" He checked with the young man. "In the corridor, between the elevator and the room. Blocking access," she said. "Demonstrating presence," he said. "The staff have been encouraged to stay at the nursing station." "Encouraged how?" His jaw moved. "One of the nurses attempted to call security. She is unharmed. She was encouraged not to continue." Naya felt something move through her chest, the fast, immediate thing. She put it back down. "Okay," she said. "Where's security?" "Facility security is 2 people. They were at the front desk when Park's men arrived. They are currently—" Sung-ho paused. "Contained in their office." "So there's no security," she said. "There is ours," he said. She nodded. "How many men does Park have on the 5th floor?" 3. "Against?" 4 of ours, counting you and me." He looked at her steadily. "Kwon does not go to the 5th floor." She looked at Kwon. He was looking at the ceiling, at the floor plan visible in the light panels, reading the building's geography through the architecture the way you learn to read buildings when you've spent enough time in difficult ones. He looked at Sung-ho and made a motion. Sung-ho's face went through something complicated. "He disagrees," Naya said. "He is incorrect," Sung-ho said. Kwon made the motion again, sharper. "Sir?" Sung-ho stopped. In 9 years, she thought, he had probably said sir at the beginning of arguments he knew he'd already lost. "The elevator. If someone comes—" Kwon made a third motion. Final. The period at the end. Sung-ho exhaled through his nose, turned to the young man and spoke rapidly, and the young man peeled off toward the stairwell, and the quiet one moved to the elevator panel, and they all moved. The elevator was large enough for the wheelchair and 4 people, barely. The smell inside it was sharper than the hallway. The elevator smell of a medical facility, contained and specific. Nia stood to Kwon's left, Sung-ho on his right. The quiet one and one other man she'd started calling the second one pressed against the back wall. 5 floors. The numbers changed above the door with a patient lack of urgency that felt obscene. She became aware of her heartbeat somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd floors. Not fast yet. Present. The way your body announces itself when it senses something coming and wants you to know it's paying attention. 3rd floor. She looked at Kwon's hands. The right one moved to the joystick, not gripping it, resting on it, ready. 4th floor. Sung-ho reached into his jacket. She had known, abstractly, since the loading dock that he was carrying. The shape of it had been visible in certain lights. Seeing him touch it now made the abstract specific. The second one also reached. Also adjusted. She thought about what she had that was useful. No weapon, no training in the tactical vocabulary of what was about to happen. What she had was 11 years of walking into rooms where she wasn't wanted and making herself impossible to remove. She wasn't sure how that translated, but it was what she had. 5th floor. The elevator opened. The corridor was long and white and empty at the far end. At the near end, their end, it was not empty. 2 men, both Korean, both built for function rather than appearance, standing with the relaxed readiness of people who had been told to wait and had been waiting long enough to get comfortable about it. One of them had his back partially to the elevator, which was the kind of mistake that happens when you've been waiting in a quiet corridor for 20 minutes and nothing has happened. He corrected the mistake in about half a second. Both men turned. What happened next was fast enough that Naya experienced it more as sound and movement than as individual actions. Sung-ho came out of the elevator with the particular controlled speed of someone who is trained for close quarters, and the second one was beside him, and there was a collision of bodies against the corridor wall that produced a grunt and a sharp impact sound, and then the specific silence of people in a physical struggle where nobody has room to make noise. She stepped out of the elevator. Kwon was beside her, moving down the corridor toward room 512, moving fast. The chair's motor at its highest setting, the sound of it barely audible under everything else. She kept pace. 20 feet. 15. The third man came out of a side doorway she hadn't seen, a supply alcove, dark, and he was moving before she fully processed that he was there. He was heading for Quan, and she was between them, and she did the only thing she could do. She stepped into his path. He hit her shoulder, and she hit the wall, and the impact was concrete and immediate. Not painful yet, that would come, but present in the way of blunt force that the body records before the nerves catch up. She got a hand on his arm. Not a grip, a redirect, the instinctive deflection of someone who has learned that if you can't stop something, you can at least change where it's going. And his forward motion carried him past her into the wall instead of into the wheelchair. He recovered faster than she would have liked, got his feet under him, turned. She hit him in the throat with the edge of her palm. She had not been in a physical confrontation since a self-defense class she'd taken 6 years ago in Atlanta after her studio had been broken into, and she had retained approximately one thing from that class, and it was this. The throat is the fastest stop you can find on a person, and you don't need to be strong to reach it. You need to be willing. She was willing. He went down. Not unconscious, so on his knees, hands at his neck, the gagging sound of a person whose airway has received an argument. She stepped around him and kept moving toward 512. Quan was at the door. Minseo Quan was 26 years old, and she was awake. This was the first thing Nia registered when the door opened, that the young woman in the bed was not asleep, was not sedated, was upright against the pillows with her knees drawn up, and her hands folded in front of her with the specific posture of someone who has been waiting and has decided to wait in a position of dignity. She had her brother's eyes, dark, awake, the same quality of attention. She looked at Quan in the doorway. He looked at her. Nia stepped back, pressed herself against the corridor wall just outside the door. Some things didn't need witnesses. She heard Minseo say something in Korean. Short. Quan responded. Not much, 2 or 3 words, but she heard the roughness of his voice, and something in the roughness was different from how he'd spoken to her downstairs. Something older and more worn, the voice of someone using a language that cost them more than other languages. Minseo's response was longer, fast and low, and then it cracked slightly in the middle. The crack of someone who has been holding something in place for too long and feels it shift. Quan's voice again. Steadier. Then quiet. Then the sound of the wheelchair moving to the bedside. Nia looked down the corridor. Sung Ho was there, and the second one. One of Park's men was on the floor, zip-tied. She saw the quiet one's work in this, efficient and impersonal. The second man was against the wall, the same. The third was still on his knees in the alcove behind her. Her shoulder had started to hurt in the specific delayed way of impact that takes 10 minutes to find its voice. She heard footsteps on the stairwell, heavy, multiple. She tensed. The young man, the one from the ground floor entrance, came through the stairwell door first, followed by 2 others she recognized from the apartment. He caught her eye and shook his head, clear, which was the gesture that meant Park's other resources weren't coming this direction. Yet. She let out a breath that felt like it had been in her lungs since the elevator. Sung Ho came to her, looked at her shoulder, at the wall behind her where she'd hit it. Are you... I'm fine, she said. He looked at her the way people look when fine doesn't match the evidence. I'm functional, she amended. His mouth moved. Almost something. You hit a trained operative with a palm strike. I hit a person in the throat, she said. People have throats. He looked at her for another second. Then he turned to his phone, which was buzzing with something that made his face change. What? She said. Director O, he said. He was reading the screen. The package was delivered 40 minutes ago. He looked up. The contact at the investigative division has confirmed receipt. They are currently mobilizing. A pause, and the pause had something in it. Relief, maybe, or the thing that lives just before relief when you're not sure yet if you've earned it. It is happening. She looked at the door to 512, at the sliver of light coming from under it. The sound from inside the room was quiet now. The specific quiet of 2 people in proximity after a long absence, the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. Park, she said, He's still outside. His men are contained, Sung-ho said. He doesn't know that yet. When he figures it out, the contacts team will be here in 7 minutes, Sung-ho said. Park is in a vehicle 2 blocks from a facility where 3 of his associates have just been physically detained and where evidence of his coordination of an assassination attempt is currently being processed by the National Police Agency. He paused. His options are narrowing. He doesn't know that yet either, she said. No, Sung-ho said. He doesn't. She looked at the phone in his hand. Someone should tell him. Sung-ho looked at her. Then he looked at the door to 512. He walked to it, knocked once, soft, opened it slightly and spoke in Korean, brief, informational, the tone of an aide delivering news to someone who needed it to make a decision. The response from inside was immediate. 2 words. Sung-ho turned to the corridor. He's coming out. What Jae-hyun Kwon looked like when he came through the door of room 512 was not what Nia had been expecting. And she'd spent enough of the evening revising her expectations of him that she thought she'd prepared herself for revision. He looked tired. Genuinely tired. Not the controlled fatigue of someone performing exhaustion, but the real thing. The way a person looks when the weight they've been carrying has been set down for 30 seconds and the body has immediately started accounting for everything it's been spending. His face was open in a way it hadn't been. Not soft. Open. The difference between a door being unlocked and a door being taken off its hinges. He stopped in the corridor, looked at Sung-ho, made a motion. He wants to speak to Park, Sung-ho said. The corridor went briefly quiet. Directly, Sung-ho added. By phone. Now. The young man from the stairwell was already on his phone. 40 seconds later, he had a number. Sung-ho's phone made the call. It rang 3 times. Then Park's voice. Careful now. The English gone. Korean only. The linguistic retreat of a man who had stopped performing. Sung-ho put it on speaker and held the phone toward Kwon. Kwon spoke. And the voice that came out was not the careful, effortful 2-word voice she'd heard at the restaurant table. And it was not the worn and human voice she'd heard through a hospital door. It was something else. Controlled and flat, and carrying the specific quality of someone speaking from a position so settled that the words didn't need force behind them because the force was already understood. She didn't speak Korean. She didn't need to. Park's response came after a pause, shorter than the silence that preceded it. Compressed. Kwon spoke again. 6 words. Then he made a motion to Sung-ho, who ended the call. What did he say? Nia asked. Sung-ho looked at his employer, who was looking at the end of the corridor and the stairwell door and the particular geometry of a place you go to when you're done waiting. He told Park, Sung-ho said slowly, that the evidence was already distributed, that the division was already moving, that the 3 men on the 5th floor were already contained. He paused, and then he said, You spent 2 years believing I was finished. I spent 2 years making sure I wasn't. We are not the same kind of patient. The corridor was quiet. And Park? She said. Sung-ho's phone buzzed. He looked at it, then at the window at the end of the corridor, which faced the street where Park's vehicle had been parked 2 blocks south. Park's vehicle just moved, he said. He read the screen. It went north, 1 block. It stopped. He looked up. There are 4 units blocking the north end of the street. He looked at his phone again, reading something incoming in real time. Park is getting out of the vehicle. A pause. He is... Another pause. His hands are up. The air in the corridor shifted. It was a small thing, physically. A man 2 blocks away raising his hands in a street she couldn't see, in a city that didn't know what it had just witnessed. But it moved through the 5th floor of the facility like a pressure change. She felt it in her ears, in her chest, in the particular way the people around her redistributed their weight from ready to something that wasn't quite the opposite of ready, but was adjacent to it. Sung-ho lowered the phone. He looked at his employer. Kwon had turned his chair toward the window. He was looking at the street below, at what was visible of it, the ordinary midnight street with its ordinary lights, the fraction of the world you could see from a fifth-floor window when everything that mattered was just out of sight. His hand was on the joystick, not moving, resting. She came to stand beside him at the window. She could feel the shoulder now, properly. The pain having finished its delayed arrival, settling in below the collarbone with the dull insistence of tissue that's been asked to do more than it was built for. She didn't mention it. She stood beside him, and they looked at the same window at the same street, and she could hear his breathing, level, controlled, but she could hear it, which she hadn't been able to before, which meant something had changed about the control. Something had given slightly, like a cable that had been under load for too long and has had the load removed and is now discovering the shape of itself without it. "Is she okay?" Nia asked. "Mincio." He didn't turn, but he nodded. "Good," she said. They stood at the window. From below, faint enough to be uncertain, the sound of more vehicles. Multiple. Moving fast. The sound of a city's investigative machinery arriving at an address and beginning the long, loud, documented process of consequence. Quan listened to it. His eyes were open and very still, and she watched him listen to the sound of what he'd spent 2 years building arriving finally, where it was supposed to arrive. And then the hand on the joystick moved. Not the chair, not a direction, just a small motion of the fingers, deliberate and slow, the kind of motion a body makes when it has been holding something very tightly for a very long time and is beginning, carefully, to let it go. The lights below threw themselves up against the window glass, red and blue, the rotating official colors of a reckoning that was no longer theoretical, painting the corridor wall behind them in slow, alternating sweeps, while Jae-hyun Kwan sat at the window of his sister's hospital and let himself, for the first time in 2 years, be still without it costing him anything. The red and blue lights kept rotating. Nia watched them move across the corridor wall in slow, alternating sweeps. The mechanical patience of official machinery that doesn't know or care what it costs to summon it, that arrives and does its work and will write its reports and go home. And she thought about how strange it was that something this significant looked, from the outside, like any other Friday night arrest. Lights, vehicles, men in dark jackets with lanyards, and the specific purposeful walk of people executing a warrant. The city didn't rearrange itself. The street didn't go quiet. 2 blocks south of a private medical facility, Park Do-yoon stood on a sidewalk with his hands raised and his pale gray suit still perfect at the lapels, and the world kept moving around him with total indifference. She heard it all secondhand. Sung-ho's phone, the young man from the stairwell relaying information in fragments, Director Oh from the apartment, sending updates in short bursts that Sung-ho read aloud without inflection. Park had not resisted. This was the first thing. He'd stepped out of the vehicle with his hands already up, which Sung-ho said meant he'd understood the moment the call ended, that the geometry of the evening had closed around him in a shape that didn't have an exit, and that fighting it physically would only add charges to what was already waiting. Park was many things, but he wasn't stupid about the arithmetic of self-preservation. 2 of his men from the 5th-floor corridor were transported separately. The third, the one Nia had hit in the throat, was treated at the facility before transport, which she learned about with a complicated feeling she didn't examine too closely. She'd hit a person in the throat in a hospital corridor, and he'd needed medical attention for it, and she was standing 50 feet from where it happened, and the shoulder he'd thrown her into the wall with was producing a pain that had moved from dull to specific and specific to insistent. She pressed her back against the corridor wall and breathed through it and didn't say anything. Kwan had not moved from the window. He sat in front of it with his hands in his lap and the rotating lights touching his face at intervals, red, then blue, then the ordinary fluorescent white of the corridor between cycles. And he watched the street below with the look of a man watching the conclusion of something he'd written a long time ago arriving at its final page. Not triumph. She'd expected something closer to triumph and found instead something quieter and more complicated. A kind of reckoning with what it felt like when the thing you spent 2 years building finally landed. And the landing was real, and the cost of it was also real, and both things occupied the same moment without canceling each other out. Sung-ho came to her shoulder. "The investigative division is requesting a statement," he said. "Tonight, if possible." From Kwan? From everyone present at Velour 88 this evening. A pause. Including you. She looked at him. Me. You were present for Park's statements to Mr. Kwan, the threats, the characterization of his condition, the implied coercion. Sung-ho's voice was careful and even. Your account would corroborate the audio record. She thought about this, about a statement in a language she didn't speak to an institution she didn't know in a country she'd been in for 11 days. About sitting across the table from someone with a lanyard and a recording device and describing a dinner that had started with a window seat and a candle and had ended with her hitting a man in the throat in a hospital corridor and watching police lights from a fifth-floor window. Okay, she said. Sung-ho looked at her with the same expression he'd been refining all evening, the look of a person who keeps expecting her to react differently and keeps being wrong about it. Okay, he said. The statements were taken in a conference room on the third floor of the facility, which someone had unlocked and which smelled like the rest of the building, but with an additional layer of stale coffee and the particular exhaustion of a space used for difficult conversations. A woman named Inspector Yoon conducted them. Mid-40s, short hair, the posture of someone who had been awake since yesterday and had decided to be pleasant about it because pleasantness was more efficient than the alternative. Her English was excellent and slightly formal, the English of someone who learned it properly and used it professionally and didn't waste it. She spoke to Nia first, separately. Sung-ho sat in as translator for any Korean that came up, though most of it didn't need to. Nia answered questions for 47 minutes. She answered them directly and completely, which seemed to produce in Inspector Yoon a quality of attention that sharpened slightly as the account progressed. Not surprise exactly, but the recognition that the account was consistent, detailed, and unembellished, which apparently was not always what she encountered. At the end of it, Inspector Yoon looked at her notepad for a moment, then at Nia. You struck one of Park's associates, she said. Yes, Nia said. In the throat. Yes. A pause. With your palm. Yes. Inspector Yoon wrote something. He was moving toward Mr. Kwan's wheelchair. Yes. Another pause. Is there anything you would like to add about that incident? Nia thought about it. He was bigger than me, she said, and faster. The throat was what I could reach. Inspector Yoon looked at her for a moment. Then she made another note and moved on to the next question, and Nia had the impression that the note said something that was not strictly procedural. When she came out of the conference room, Kwan was in the corridor. He'd been moved from the window, finally. Min-so had been checked by nursing staff and her attending physician, who had arrived within 20 minutes of the situation being secured, and she had been calm in the way of someone who had decided on calm as a policy rather than a response. She was stable. Her condition hadn't changed. The presence of Park's men in her corridor had been terrifying and had also been, in the cold assessment of her medical record, physically irrelevant. She was safe. Kwan knew this. Nia could see that he knew it in the way he was sitting now. Not the alert, forward-weighted posture of a man with something unresolved, but something slightly different. The posture of someone who has received the confirmation they needed and is now sitting with the aftermath of having needed it. He looked at her when she came out. She came to sit in the chair across from him, in the hallway outside the conference room, the two of them in a hospital corridor at 1:30 in the morning with the sounds of the building settling around them. Well, she said. I gave a statement. He watched her. They're going to want yours, she said, at some point. Written or however... She stopped. However you want to do it. He made a motion she recognized, the one that meant acknowledged and filed, the small economy of a man who processed information and moved it to the appropriate internal compartment without ceremony. She stretched her neck to the left. The shoulder twinged and she stopped. He noticed. Of course he noticed. She'd spent the evening watching him notice everything. He made a different motion, this one to Sung-ho, who appeared from around the corner with the reliability of someone who had never fully left. Sung-ho looked at her shoulder. At the corridor wall that was visible behind her, the small scuff on the paint she hadn't noticed until now. You should have that looked at, he said. It's fine. Ms. Brooks, It's a bruise, Sung-ho. She looked at him. I've had bruises before. He made the face again, the wrong about her face. She was becoming fond of it, in a tired 1:30 in the morning kind of way. A nurse appeared, spoke briefly to Sung-ho, and disappeared back toward the room. Sung-ho turned to Kwon and spoke. Kwon listened, and his face did the thing she'd been watching it do all evening. Absorb information, process it somewhere interior, return to its surface quality of stillness. But the stillness had a different texture now. Warmer, less defended. Min-seo is asking for him, Sung-ho said. Kwon was already moving. What? She waited in the corridor for a long time. She sat in the chair outside room 512 with her bad shoulder against the armrest and her feet flat on the floor, and she waited while the building did its quiet nighttime things around her. The distant monitor, the occasional footstep of nursing staff, the ventilation system that cycled on and off with a sound like the building breathing. Sung-ho came and went. The young man from the stairwell sat against the far wall with his phone and the specific posture of someone who has done a lot of waiting in corridors and has made his peace with it. She thought about the dinner, about Yemi's phone call, and the dress and the taxi and the address she'd half believed was real. She thought about the host's hand on the back of the wheelchair, that dismissive, proprietary grip, and about how she'd stood up from her table without a plan, without a calculation, without anything except the knowledge that what she was watching was wrong in a way she'd seen before and couldn't sit still for. She had not known who he was. This was important to her, sitting in this corridor at 1:30 in the morning with a bruised shoulder and a statement on record. She had not known, and it hadn't mattered because the wrongness of it hadn't required knowledge to identify. Some things you recognize without being able to name them, and the recognition demands a response, and the response is not always comfortable or safe or advisable, and she had learned a long time ago that this was not a reason to withhold it. The door to 512 opened. Kwon came out slowly. Not the careful speed of the elevator, not the directed urgency of the corridor confrontation. Slowly. The way you come out of a room when the room has done something to you that you need a moment to carry correctly. He stopped in the corridor. He looked at Nea. She stood up. How is she? He considered. Then he held up one hand, flat, horizontal, the gesture that meant level. Steady. Okay. Good, she said. He moved to the chair beside hers, not the one across, the one beside, and positioned the wheelchair there and cut the motor. The corridor was quiet. They sat, not talking, not filling it, just two people sitting in a hospital corridor at 1:30 in the morning with the weight of the evening distributed between them in a way that had stopped being burdensome and was becoming something else. Not light, not comfortable, but settled. The kind of silence that has been earned. She looked at his profile. The scar tissue she'd noticed at the restaurant, more visible now in the flat fluorescent lighting, a ridge along the left jaw that disappeared under his collar, the evidence of what a bullet does when it doesn't quite find what it was looking for. He'd taken two of them while standing between his sister and the people who'd been paid to end him. He'd spent the months after learning whether his body would work again, and the months after that learning what to do with a body that worked differently than it had, and the months after that building a 14-month case in silence while the people who'd tried to kill him believed they'd succeeded. She'd known difficult people. She'd known people who'd built things out of loss. But this was a particular kind of architecture, what you build when the building itself has to be invisible until it's complete. Can I ask you something? She said. He turned his head toward her. The dinner tonight, she said. The reservation, the specific restaurant. She paused. You own it. You knew how you'd be treated. You needed it documented. She looked at him. Did you know someone would... Did you expect someone to intervene, or was it just... She stopped. She wasn't sure how to finish the question. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head. Once. Definite. You didn't expect it, she said. He shook his head again, and something in the motion was different from his earlier communications. Less contained, more direct, the answer carrying a weight he wasn't trying to manage. So I was just... She thought about the word. Accidental. He held her gaze. He made a small motion with his right hand, not one of the procedural gestures she'd catalogued over the course of the evening, but something new. He opened his hand, palm up, and turned it slightly, the gesture of something being offered or acknowledged. Then he touched his chest once. Just that. She understood it. She wasn't certain she could have explained how, but she understood it. The distinction he was making between accidental and real, between coincidence and the thing that arrived through coincidence and turned out to matter. "Okay," she said. They sat in the corridor. Sung-ho found them there 20 minutes later, when the facility had gone even quieter, and the red and blue from the street had finally stopped. He stood before them with the quality of someone delivering information they've sorted into categories of urgency, and she could see him making the decision about which category to lead with. "Park is in custody," he said. "Formally. Booked. The warrants cover the assassination attempt, the coordinated assault on this facility, the evidence of financial crimes that the package documented." He paused. 3 of his closest financial associates were detained in the last hour. Their accounts are frozen. Kwon's chin moved. Barely. "The 3 lieutenants who changed allegiance," Sung-ho continued, 2 of them, Lee and Choi, contacted Director Oh in the last 40 minutes, independently, offering cooperation with the investigation. He let this sit for a moment. The 3rd, Kim Jae-soo, appears to have left the country. His passport was used at Incheon at 11:50. Kwon's jaw set. One motion. "We expected one of the 3 to run," Sung-ho said. "It was Kim. We expected Kim." He said this as though confirming something already accounted for, a variable that had been calculated for and was now simply confirming its value. "What about the restaurant?" Nia said. "The owner." Sung-ho looked at her. "Mr. Han." He was recorded degrading Kwon, cooperating with Park when Park arrived, allowing Park's men access to "Mr. Han is being interviewed by the investigative division as a witness," Sung-ho said carefully. His cooperation with Park this evening, combined with the audio and visual record of his treatment of Mr. Kwon, creates a significant legal and commercial exposure for him. A pause. "Mr. Kwon's legal team will be in contact with him in the morning." She looked at Kwon. "The restaurant." He made the palm-open gesture again. Different context, same motion, the gesture of something being returned to its correct position. "He's taking it back," she said. "It was always his," Sung-ho said. She nodded slowly. She thought about the owner's voice, the practiced dismissal of it, the specific fluency of a man who'd spent years being condescending to people he believed were below his consideration, and how that fluency had operated all evening in a room that was recording everything in a building owned by the man he was condescending to. The universe had a quality of irony tonight that she was too tired to fully appreciate, but she registered it. "The staff," she said. "The host. The floor manager. The waiters who—" "They acted consistent with the culture Mr. Han created in that establishment," Sung-ho said. "Some of them will lose positions. The host—" He paused. "The host is 23. He will likely retain his job in a different capacity, pending review." "That's generous," she said. "Mr. Kwon's instruction," Sung-ho said. She looked at Kwon. He was looking at his hands. "You're giving a 23-year-old a second chance," she said. He didn't look up, but the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. Too small for that, too complicated. The movement of something that had once known how to be a smile and was remembering. At 2:40 in the morning, Sung-ho brought 2 cups of coffee from somewhere in the facility's lower floor. He set one in front of Nia and one on the armrest of Kwon's chair and retreated to a respectful distance, which she had come to understand was not absence, but the particular form of presence that a loyal person maintains when they understand that proximity would be an intrusion. She held the cup. The heat of it was specific and real, the most ordinary sensation she'd experienced since sitting down at Velour 88, however many hours ago it had been. She pressed both hands around it and felt the warmth move into her palms. Kwon picked up his cup. He held it the same way. Both hands, the heat, the ordinary anchoring fact of something warm. She watched him do it, and thought about the 2 years of a life she didn't fully know, the hospital, and the recovery, and the private residence, and the 14 months of planning conducted from a chair while an empire dissolved around him. And she thought about what it was like to hold a cup of coffee when those 2 years were finally behind you. She didn't ask. Some things weren't questions. "I'm going back to Atlanta in 6 days," she said. He looked at her. "My return flight." She looked at the cup. "The deal is closed. The contract is signed. I have a company to go run." She looked up. "I live there. That's my life." He held her gaze with the quality of attention that she'd spent the whole evening inside, that total and undivided presence, and she let herself look back without looking away, because there was something in this moment that deserved direct contact rather than deflection. He reached into his jacket. Slowly, she watched him do it, the deliberate care of it, and produced a card. Small, white, no logo. He held it out. She took it. 2 things on it: his name, in both Korean and English, and a phone number. She looked at it, turned it over. The back was blank. "This is your personal number," she said. He held her gaze. "Not Sung Ho's," she said. "Not Director O's. Yours." He nodded. She held the card for a moment, feeling the weight of it, which was not in the paper. She'd been handed a lot of cards in 11 years of business. She'd been handed cards by people who wanted something from her, and people who had something to offer, and people who weren't sure which they were yet. She knew what a card meant when it was given with an agenda, and she knew what it meant when it was given without one. And she understood, sitting in this corridor, that this card was something she didn't have a prior category for. It was a card given by a person who was not accustomed to giving them, to a person who hadn't asked for it, in the aftermath of a night that had cost both of them something real. And what it said was not, "I want something from you," but rather, "You are someone I don't want to lose track of." And that distinction mattered to her. She put it in her jacket pocket. "If I call that number," she said, "what happens?" He thought for a moment. He spread both hands slightly, a gesture she hadn't seen before, an openness in it, an uncertainty that was honest rather than performed. "You don't know," she said. He shook his head. "Okay," she said. "That's honest." He looked at her. Something in his face did the thing it had been doing all evening, the weather moving through it, fast and then gone. But this time it stayed slightly longer than before, long enough to identify. It wasn't grief, and it wasn't relief, and it wasn't gratitude, though it had elements of all three. It was the look of a person who has spent a very long time in a room with the door locked from the outside, and who has recently been reminded that there are rooms with doors that open differently, and who is not yet sure what to do with the reminder, but is holding it carefully. She recognized it. She'd worn it herself, at various points in 11 years of building something in spaces that kept telling her she didn't belong. "My company has a Seoul office now," she said. "Effectively, the contract I signed yesterday requires at least 2 visits a year." She paused. "So I'll be back." He looked at her. "I'm not saying that as—" She stopped, thought about what she was saying, decided to say it directly, because she'd spent the evening watching what happened when people communicated in code and indirection, and she didn't want to replicate it. "I'm saying I'm not going to disappear. I'll be back. And if you—" She paused again. "Let it be simple. If you want to have dinner at a restaurant where neither of us gets seated at the worst table, I'm open to that." The corner of his mouth moved again. This time it stayed. Small, contained, the beginning of something that his face hadn't fully committed to yet. But there, visible, real. He picked up his coffee, held it up slightly, a gesture she'd seen before in different contexts, acknowledgement, acceptance, the small ceremony of 2 people agreeing to something without making it larger than it is. She touched her cup to his. They drank. Sung-ho drove her to the hotel at 3:15. Kwon stayed at the facility. Min-seo's physician wanted to run a precautionary assessment in the morning, given the disruption of the evening, and Kwon had indicated with 3 words to Sung-ho, who relayed them to Nia as she gathered her jacket from the corridor chair, that he would remain until the assessment was complete, after which he would return to the apartment. The apartment, Sung-ho said, with the careful tone of someone adjusting a word, was now the residence rather than a temporary location. He was home. She shook Sung-ho's hand in the corridor before they left. He looked at her hand in his as though the gesture was unfamiliar in this context, then looked at her. "You did well tonight," he said. "You don't need to say that," she said. "I know," he said. "I said it anyway." She nodded. "Take care of him." "I have been taking care of him for 9 years," Sung-ho said. "I know," she said. "Keep going." Something moved in the aide's face. The faintest version of the expression she'd seen him wear all evening, the one that meant she'd said something that landed in a place he hadn't fully expected. "Yes," he said. "I intend to." She went back to the door of 512. She knocked once, opened it slightly, just enough to look in, not enough to intrude. Kwon was beside his sister's bed. Min-seo was asleep, finally the deep sleep of a person who has been frightened and then reassured and has used up everything in between. Kwon sat with his hands in his lap and his face in profile to the door, and he was looking at his sister with the expression of someone performing the most fundamental act available to a person, watching someone they love be safe after a period in which safety was not guaranteed. He didn't see her in the doorway. She stayed for 2 seconds. 3. Then she pulled the door closed with the care of someone who understands that certain moments don't need witnesses. She walked down the corridor, past the scuff mark on the wall, past the alcove where Park's third man had come at her from the dark, into the elevator, which carried her down through the floors of the building with its patient medical rhythm. The lobby. The front entrance. The cold outside, still there, still the specific October cold of this city at 3 in the morning. Sung-ho was waiting beside the vehicle. She got in. The city moved past the windows the way it always did. Indifferent, continuous, the ordinary spectacle of a place where millions of people were asleep, or almost asleep, or recently awake, living their lives at the usual distance from each other. None of them knowing what had happened tonight in a restaurant on one street and a hospital on another street, and a parking structure where lights had been cut and a sidewalk where a man in a pale gray suit had raised his hands. She pressed her back against the seat, the shoulder caught. She breathed through it. "You should have that looked at," Sung-ho said from the front, without turning. "In the morning," she said. "The hotel has a physician on call." "In the morning, Sung-ho." He was quiet. Then, "You have a good flight." 6 days, she said. "I told him." "I know, he told me." She looked at the back of Sung-ho's head. The city lights moved across it. "What did he say about it?" A pause. "He said 6 days was enough time for him to determine the state of the restaurant's kitchen and whether it merited a proper reopening." Another pause. "And that if you were willing to return for dinner on your last evening, the window table would be reserved." She looked at the window, at the city sliding past it. "Table 7, she said. "Yes," Sung-ho said. She nodded. Let the city move. Let the night move. Let the weight of the evening settle itself into the past tense, where it would live from now on. The concrete fact of a Friday night in Seoul that had started with a taxi and a dress, and a signed contract, and had ended with something she didn't have a clean name for yet, which was fine. Some things didn't need names immediately. Some things you carried for a while first, and let them tell you what they were. The hotel room was the same as she'd left it that morning. She hadn't left it that many hours ago, less than 12, technically, though it had accumulated enough inside it to feel like a different order of time. She set her jacket on the chair by the window, took her phone from her pocket. 3 missed calls from Yemi, who was 7 hours behind in Lagos and had apparently been awake at 2 in the morning Lagos time, wondering why her business partner had gone silent on a celebratory dinner evening. She sat on the edge of the bed. Texted Yemi, "I'm fine. Dinner was eventful. Call you tomorrow. Tell you everything." She put the phone on the nightstand. She took the card from her jacket pocket and held it for a moment. Looked at the name. Looked at the number. The card was simple and plain in the way of things that don't need to announce themselves, that are simply what they are. She put it on the nightstand beside her phone. She looked at the window. The Seoul skyline held its position behind the glass. The same skyline she'd looked at from Velour 88 hours ago, from table 7, across a candle, across a man in a wheelchair who had been watching the room memorize everything it chose to show him. The lights of it were the same lights. The city was the same city. Everything that had happened inside it tonight had happened without the city noticing, which was the way of cities, which was fine, which was how it should be. She pressed her hand to her shoulder. The bruise had settled into its final shape, the specific deep ache of muscle that has been asked to absorb impact and has done so, and is now accounting for the cost. She would have it looked at in the morning. She would call Yemi in the morning. She would handle the 14 unread emails in the morning and the follow-up with the sole distributor and the question of what kind of ongoing relationship she now had with a man who had handed her a card with his personal number and suggested dinner at a table reserved in his name. In the morning. All of it. In the morning. She lay back on the bed without taking her shoes off, which was a thing she never did, and she looked at the ceiling of a hotel room in Seoul, and she breathed, and her shoulder ached, and the city went on outside the window, and she let the evening sit with her for a while in the particular stillness of a night that has finally finished becoming itself. She thought about the card on the nightstand, about a man sitting beside his sister's bed while she slept. About 9 years of loyalty in the form of a young aide who said "I know" before she finished her sentences. About a restaurant where the worst table was beside the kitchen door and the best table was by the window, and the distance between them was about 40 feet, and the cost of the crossing had turned out to be considerable and worth every bit of it. She thought about the host's hand on the wheelchair, the thing that had made her stand up without a plan. She thought about how many rooms she'd walked into in 11 years, and how many of them had tried to tell her where she was allowed to stand, and how she'd learned to recognize the moment where you could absorb the instruction or refuse it, and how the refusal was rarely comfortable and occasionally landed you in a hospital corridor in the early hours of a Saturday morning with a bruised shoulder and a statement on record and a card with a phone number on the nightstand. She didn't regret any of it. This was the thing she took stock of, lying on the hotel bed with her shoes on. Not what she'd risked or what it had cost, but whether she'd do it again. And the answer came back immediately and without ambiguity, the way the true answers do when you're too tired to argue with yourself. Yes, she'd do it again. Not because he was who he turned out to be, not because the evening had resolved the way it had, but because the man at the worst table in the restaurant had been a person, and persons deserved to be treated as such, and that principle didn't depend on outcome. It had been true before she knew his name, and it was true now, and it would be true in 6 days when she sat across a window table from him, and they figured out what happened next. She closed her eyes. Outside, Seoul held its million-lit windows against the dark, and in a hospital on an eastern street, a man sat beside his sleeping sister and let 2 years of silence finally become the past. And across the city, in a holding facility whose address she didn't know, Park Do-hyun sat with the weight of 18 months of evidence arranged against him, and the night moved toward morning the way nights do, without hurrying, without ceremony, simply moving, the way everything moves when the extraordinary thing is finished and the ordinary world reclaims its hours. The card was on the nightstand. She slept.